Today, we are going to look at the worst revenge deaths ever recorded, from a sabotaged zipline harness that sent a victim plummeting 70 feet to their death to a weaponized lunch that triggered a fatal heart attack in a warehouse break room. It was April 9, 2015 in Miami, Florida. The morning air was warm and humid, carrying the faint scent of salt from Biscayne Bay. Along a narrow alley behind a small commercial strip, a quiet tension had settled. Samantha Rowley, 39, owned a boutique specializing in artisanal jewelry and high-end accessories. She had built the business from scratch over the past decade, gaining a modest local reputation for her keen eye and uncompromising standards. Professionally, Samantha was confident and assertive, qualities that earned her respect, but sometimes animosity. She had recently been involved in a legal dispute with Andre Marin, a local businessman, where her public testimony had embarrassed him, with social pressures and minor local fame amplifying the tension. Her daily routine involved opening the boutique early, cataloging inventory, and arranging displays. She knew her environment well, the layout of the store, the back alley, and the reinforced access points, but she underestimated the determination of someone motivated by revenge. Her security system included cameras and motion detectors, yet she often relied on visual checks herself rather than waiting for alarm verification. This complacency, coupled with a predictable schedule, left her exposed. On the morning of April 9th, an intruder hired to exact revenge and disguise the murder as a burglary approached the back entrance. Samantha was inside preparing for the day's first deliveries. Surveillance cameras recorded a masked figure prying at the door, struggling to lift the latch. The intruder gained entry, stepping carefully but purposefully into the storage area. Samantha, hearing the noise, moved toward the back room, unaware that she was confronting a calculated threat rather than a petty thief. She attempted to block the intruder, gesturing and speaking, but the figure struck her immediately with a blunt instrument. Neighbors later reported hearing screams that cut sharply through the morning calm. Witnesses outside the alley saw movement and the figure retreating, dragging Samantha briefly toward the back office. Items from her desk and counters were strewn across the floor, staged to mimic a robbery, but mistakenly left valuables untouched. The intruder's exit was hurried, leaving behind scattered papers and an overturned chair, but surveillance clearly captured the masked figure's deliberate actions. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes of neighbor calls. Samantha was found unresponsive on the floor, the scene showing repeated blunt force trauma to the head. Her body displayed multiple skull fractures, hemorrhaging, brain contusions, and lacerations, as well as defensive wounds on her forearms and hands. Consistent with high-impact strikes, blood pooling and body position indicated rapid incapacitation. Forensic examination confirmed blunt force trauma to the head with skull fractures, hemorrhage, and brain laceration. Manner of death classified as homicide. Police investigation used CCTV footage and fingerprints matched through the local database, quickly identifying the hired intruder within 3 days. The hitman admitted in court that he assaulted Samantha under Andre Marin's instructions and was sentenced to 20 years for second-degree murder and conspiracy. Consistent with Florida sentencing guidelines, Andre Marin was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, receiving a 35-year prison sentence. While both men initially showed little remorse, the hitman later spoke privately about regretting the violence and its irreversible consequences. It was April 9, 2018 in Columbus, Ohio. During a regular weekday shift at a regional distribution warehouse, forklifts moved between aisles, conveyor belts hummed without pause, and workers cycled through breaks on staggered schedules. The environment felt routine, noisy, and familiar. Another ordinary morning inside an industrial workspace. Mark Ellison was 41 years old and had worked in warehouse logistics for nearly 8 years. His job kept him moving between inventory racks, shipping stations, and loading docks, handling counts and labels on rotating schedules. Co-workers described him as blunt and private. He took breaks alone and rarely joined conversations. One issue followed him throughout the building: lunches disappearing from the shared refrigerator. Over time, several employees believed Mark was responsible. He denied it whenever the topic came up, and no proof ever surfaced. Nathan Reed, 34, worked the same shift in a different section of the warehouse. Unlike Mark, Nathan was vocal about the problem. Over the course of a month, he lost at least 4 packed lunches. He reported it twice to a supervisor, but the fridge had no lock and no camera coverage inside. Nothing changed. According to co-workers, tension grew between the two men. Nathan openly blamed Mark, and Mark responded by dismissing the accusations. The conflict stayed quiet but unresolved. Nathan chose retaliation without confrontation. He later told investigators he wanted to stop the lunch theft by sending a message. The night before, he prepared a sandwich layered with concentrated ghost pepper extract, a novelty product labeled with warnings about extreme physical distress. He wrapped it, wrote his name on the bag, and placed it in the shared refrigerator before the morning shift. Shortly before noon, office CCTV showed Mark entering the break room alone. He removed Nathan's labeled sandwich, sat near the vending machines, and took a bite. Within seconds, he stopped, coughed sharply, and pushed back his chair. He stood breathing unevenly, one hand pressed to his chest. Witnesses later said he appeared confused and unsteady. Mark staggered a few steps, leaned briefly against the vending machine, then collapsed. One co-worker ran for help while another called 911 at 12:17 p.m. Employees attempted basic assistance until paramedics arrived minutes later. Mark showed no response and was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as fatal cardiac arrhythmia precipitated by an acute stress response. An undiagnosed heart murmur made him vulnerable to sudden rhythm failure. The intense physiological stress caused by the pepper exposure, sympathetic nervous system surge, rapid heart rate, blood pressure spike, and oxygen demand precipitated the fatal event. There were no drugs or alcohol involved. Investigators reviewed CCTV footage, break room video, and employee interviews. Nathan admitted to deliberately preparing the sandwich to punish the person he believed was stealing from him. Prosecutors determined that intentionally tampering with food using a known extreme irritant constituted reckless conduct with foreseeable risk. Nathan was charged with involuntary manslaughter under Ohio law and later sentenced to 6 years in state prison. Authorities classified the case as a revenge killing carried out without intent to murder. Afterward, the warehouse removed the shared refrigerator and installed individual lockers. Food tampering was added to termination-level offenses. Safety briefings began referencing the case as an example of how retaliation can turn a minor grievance into a fatal act. It was May 22, 2017, in Leipzig, Germany. A dormant threat born of malice. Staff moving between stations were unaware that the hydraulic press, one of the largest on the line, had been compromised. Klaus Brenner, 45, had worked as a press operator for over 2 decades, respected for his precision and reliability. He managed heavy machinery with years of accumulated skill, understanding the timing, pressures, and load tolerances of each hydraulic system. Klaus was known among colleagues for his methodical nature and quiet professionalism. Outside of work, he volunteered with a local technical school, mentoring apprentices in industrial safety and metalworking techniques. Despite his caution, Klaus often relied on routine and habit, assuming that standard safety interlocks and emergency stops were fully functional. Klaus's responsibilities included feeding large metal sheets into presses capable of exerting hundreds of tons of force, operating controls from a short distance while monitoring alignment, and coordinating with line assistants to maintain workflow. The machinery required precise calibration and awareness of potential hazards like misfeeds, hydraulic leaks, and unexpected system cycles. He wore all standard protective gear, steel-toed boots, gloves, and a reinforced apron. But his confidence in the equipment's safety systems created a blind spot, particularly toward human interference. CCTV footage showed that in the morning of May 22, 2017, a former supervisor, recently terminated in January, had returned with clear intent to sabotage, slipping through the busy factory floor wearing his work uniform. The safety interlock on the primary hydraulic press had been deliberately bypassed by tampering with the control circuitry, leaving the machine capable of cycling even when guards were open. Co-workers noticed a faint difference in the press's operational hum, but dismissed it as routine maintenance noise. Klaus began his shift, lining up a stack of metal sheets, unaware of the tampering. The factory floor was busier than usual due to a large order, adding mild distraction and pressure to maintain efficiency. As Klaus lifted the first sheet into position, he followed his standard procedure, checking alignment and applying gradual pressure through the controls. A sudden mechanical jolt occurred as the press cycled unexpectedly due to the sabotaged interlock. Colleagues on either side froze as the machine descended. Witnesses described a sharp impact noise audible across the immediate section of the factory, startling nearby workers. Klaus was unable to withdraw. The emergency stop and manual override had been disabled by the sabotage, preventing any intervention. The press's ram struck Klaus's torso, compressing his chest and abdomen in an instant. The floor became chaotic, with alarms blaring and workers shouting for emergency assistance. Factory cameras captured the motionless form beneath the ram, and the frantic attempts of co-workers, providing a clear record of the rapid, fatal sequence. Emergency medical services were contacted, arriving within 10 minutes. Autopsy later confirmed multiple crush injuries to thorax and abdomen, with cause of death listed as blunt force trauma due to industrial press. The manner of death was determined to be homicide. Investigators reviewed footage, maintenance logs, and fingerprints, ultimately tracing the tampering to the former supervisor. The individual's actions constituted serious criminal offenses under German law. Following the incident, authorities issued a national wanted notice and coordinated with Interpol. As evidence suggested, the suspect had left Germany within days. Factory management immediately replaced safety interlocks on all presses and retrained operators on emergency procedures. The press line resumed work only after structural and procedural inspections ensured full compliance with safety protocols. Despite the identification of the suspect, authorities have not located him. It was September 11, 2014, in Alberta, near the end of the summer season. Campgrounds were quieter, nights cooler, and trails less crowded. Notice boards listed routine wildlife advisories, weather updates, and campsite rules. Information many visitors scanned briefly before settling in for the night. Maya Laurent was 27 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator in Calgary. She kept a structured routine, office hours during the week, short weekend trips, and regular check-ins with friends and family. Evan Brooks, 30, worked in outdoor equipment sales and cultivated an image of confidence and authority in wilderness settings. He frequently positioned himself as the expert, dismissing posted advisories and presenting risk as something he knew how to manage. Earlier that month, Maya confronted Evan after discovering he had been seeing someone else. The relationship deteriorated quickly. Messages later reviewed by investigators showed escalating hostility, arguments over shared expenses, and repeated threats from Evan about cutting Maya off financially and emotionally. Friends described Evan as increasingly resentful over losing control of the relationship. When Maya attempted to distance herself, Evan proposed a camping trip, framing it as a chance to resolve things on his terms. Messages showed Maya was hesitant, but Evan insisted the trip would be isolated, quiet, and under his control. Evan selected a remote pull-in campsite accessed by a gravel road, away from staffed campgrounds. GPS data later showed he bypassed 2 closer sites with bear lockers and overnight patrols. The chosen site had no permanent food storage, only posted instructions advising visitors to secure food in vehicles or hang it properly. That week, wildlife advisories warned of increased bear activity in the area due to recent food conditioning incidents. Night temperatures were expected to drop into the low 40s. They arrived before dusk. Maya recorded a short video of the campsite: dense trees, a fire ring, and a narrow clearing. Evan handled the setup and initially placed food inside the vehicle. As night fell, Maya's phone recorded intermittent clips, referencing unresolved tension and the isolation of the site. At 10:11 p.m., Evan told her he was driving to a washroom area down the road. He took the vehicle and all the stored food. GPS logs later showed the car traveling away from the facilities and toward the highway instead. Minutes later, Maya's phone began recording again, She called Evan's name once, then again. There was no reply. Audio captured movement in the brush, heavy steps and branches snapping. Her voice rose slightly as she asked if anyone was there. Low growling followed, then closer movement. The phone camera shook as she backed away from the fire ring. A metallic clatter was recorded. Then the phone dropped, landing sideways among pine needles. The recording continued without video. Audio captured rapid movement, sustained noise consistent with an animal encounter, and then silence. The recording ended several minutes later when the battery failed. There was no further activity from Maya's phone. The next morning, a park worker noticed an unattended campsite during a routine check and contacted rangers. Maya was found near the edge of the clearing. Tracks and physical evidence indicated a bear attack. Wildlife officers confirmed recent bear movement through the area overnight. The medical examiner ruled the death a fatal animal mauling, consistent with a large bear. The report noted that nighttime conditions, lack of food storage, and the absence of a vehicle or deterrence greatly increased risk. GPS data and cell phone location records showed Evan arriving at the campsite and leaving shortly before the incident, with no return overnight. He was later located at a roadside motel in Alberta. Investigators also recovered messages showing he was aware of recent bear activity and had deliberately chosen an isolated site without food storage or patrols. Evan Brooks was convicted of criminal negligence causing death and sentenced to 7 years in a federal correctional facility. Park authorities later expanded food storage access and updated guidance on the dangers of leaving companions alone in remote areas. It was October 11th, 2018. A cool, bright Thursday settled over the edge of Quebec City, where the shipping yard near the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River stood quiet under a pale autumn sky. Containers were stacked in neat grids, forklifts parked in rows, radios silent. It was lunchtime. Marc-André Boucher crossed the gravel lot alone, heading toward his pickup truck and walking straight into a deadly confrontation. Marc-André was a 51-year-old forklift operator who had spent 16 years working the industrial port. Known for being even-tempered and hard-working, he rarely missed a shift, kept meticulous logs of cargo movements, and often helped train new hires. Outside of work, he lived a quiet life with his wife in Beauport and took pride in small things, tinkering with old radios, mowing his lawn, and staying out of trouble. 3 months earlier, during a routine inventory audit, Marc-André uncovered discrepancies in load counts and flagged them to HR. A follow-up investigation revealed that foreman Serge Lamontagne had been falsifying outgoing shipment data for years, inflating hours, and moving product without records. Marc-André's detailed statement was instrumental in the inquiry that led to Serge's suspension, though he remained on site in a reduced role. By early October, tension had returned to the yard. Serge avoided eye contact and kept his distance from the man who had exposed his crimes. Marc-André didn't speak much about the situation. That Thursday, at approximately 12:17 p.m., Marc-André paused between rows of containers to check a text from his wife. He held his lunchbox in one hand, phone in the other, completely unaware that death was approaching from the shadows. Lucy Tremblay, a co-worker walking nearby, witnessed what happened next. Serge emerged from between two containers carrying something in his hand. She initially thought it was a tool until she saw him raise it with murderous intent. Serge approached quickly and, without warning, raised a large steel wrench and struck Marc-André across the back of the head with devastating force. The sound of impact was sharp and immediate. Marc-André dropped to one knee, then collapsed sideways onto the gravel. Lucy screamed as Serge stepped forward and struck again, this time to the temple with brutal precision. Lucy rushed in, grabbing Serge's arm, but he shoved her off with a blank expression that she later said chilled her to the bone. Other workers, hearing the commotion, ran from the break room. Serge dropped the bloody wrench and fled between trailers toward the back gate, leaving Marc-André motionless on the ground, with blood pooling beneath his right ear. One of his co-workers phoned for help. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and confirmed death at the scene from massive head trauma. Police located Serge at his apartment in Beauport that afternoon and arrested him without incident. Murder charges were filed the next morning. Marc-André's funeral was held the following Tuesday at Église Saint-Ignace de Loyola, attended by dozens of co-workers, family, and longtime neighbors. His wife, Mireille, delivered a brief eulogy, remembering him as a quiet man who believed in doing what was right. even when it cost him. Officials conducted a full internal review of how Serge Lamontagne had remained employed on site after his suspension. Workplace safety inspectors also launched an investigation into procedural gaps that may have enabled the attack to occur unnoticed. It was July 11, 2016, in Melbourne, Australia. The morning was clear, with sunlight glinting off wet streets from an overnight drizzle. Traffic flowed steadily. Cyclists wove between commuters, and on the corner of a busy intersection, a simmering argument was about to erupt into a deadly confrontation. Elliot Granger, 29, worked as a software developer at a mid-sized tech firm. He spent weekdays immersed in coding and debugging, often solving complex problems under tight deadlines outside work. Elliot was an avid cyclist, using weekends to train and explore city streets for fitness and recreation. However, he had previously reported repeated confrontations with a neighbor over parking disputes, including threats and aggressive gestures. Elliot's cycling gear was standard for urban riders: high-visibility jersey, helmet, and reflective strips on his bike. He trusted these precautions and his knowledge of local traffic patterns to keep him safe. The neighborhood had moderate traffic, crosswalks, and signals, but intersections could be chaotic during morning hours. Surveillance footage later confirmed the neighbor's vehicle, a black SUV driven by Darius Kincaid, had been involved in multiple aggressive maneuvers near the apartment driveway and intersection in the weeks prior, signaling a potential threat. That morning, Elliot cycled to a local cafe, taking a familiar route past the disputed apartment complex. Darius was observed leaving the property in the black SUV, engine running aggressively, glancing toward the street where Elliot would cross. Despite prior warnings from police about escalating hostility, Elliot continued his route, assuming the conflict would not escalate to physical harm. Pedestrians and nearby cafe patrons noted tension in the street, but few anticipated violence. As Elliot approached the intersection, the SUV accelerated. Witnesses described the vehicle veering slightly to strike the cyclist directly at approximately 25 miles per hour. Elliot attempted to brake and swerve, but the impact threw him several meters across the asphalt. He was first struck by the front bumper, then secondary impact with the pavement and curb, his bike crumpling beneath him. He suffered direct trauma to the torso and abdomen. Bystanders called emergency services immediately, some trying to provide first aid. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Elliot was unconscious, pale, and bleeding internally, with labored, shallow breathing. Assessment indicated massive abdominal trauma, including lacerations to the liver and spleen, hypotension, and tachycardia, consistent with hemorrhagic shock. Despite rapid intervention and attempts at stabilization, vital signs deteriorated. Witness footage from nearby shops captured the SUV fleeing the scene moments after impact, tires squealing, leaving only shocked pedestrians behind. Forensic examination later confirmed that Elliot died from blunt force trauma to the torso, which caused lacerations to the liver and spleen, resulting in hemorrhagic shock. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Investigators analyzed vehicle deformation, skid marks, paint transfer, and surveillance footage, along with witness statements, to conclusively link the SUV to Darius Kincaid. He was subsequently arrested and charged with manslaughter, pending further assessment of intent under Australian law. It was August 14, 2018, off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, aboard a small contractor-run dive vessel supporting inspection work. The sea was calm, visibility was good, and multiple boats were anchored along the reef. Divers moved methodically across the deck, checking gear, logging depths, and setting cameras before entering the water. From above, everything looked controlled. Among the divers on board that morning was Andrew Collins, 34, a marine survey technician who spent most of his working life underwater. He inspected docks, pilings, and submerged cables, often logging hundreds of dives a year. He was experienced and methodical, favoring surface-supplied air for longer jobs that required staying in one position rather than descending deep. The assignment that day was routine, a shallow inspection for a private contractor, the kind of work he had done many times before. Ryan Mercer, 36, was also assigned to the boat. He and Andrew had worked together for years, but their relationship had soured after a dispute over inspection records that cost Ryan future work. Colleagues later described months of unresolved tension and deliberate avoidance. Despite that history, scheduling placed them on the same charter that morning. Andrew entered the water first, wearing a helmet-mounted camera connected to a surface-supplied air hose from the deck compressor. Crew members later confirmed the line was checked and secured before descent. Deck cameras showed Ryan remaining near the compressor after Andrew submerged. As a separate diver surfaced unexpectedly and required assistance at the rail, a concurrent safety issue briefly drew crew attention away from the compressor area, allowing Ryan to move behind stacked tanks and handle Andrew's air hose for several seconds. Underwater footage shows Andrew working steadily along the reef wall. His breathing is calm as he adjusts his position and continues the inspection. About 9 minutes in, the audio shifts. Breathing becomes uneven. Air bubbles drop sharply. Andrew pauses, looks toward the hose, and tugs it once. He signals upward and begins to swim, but the line slackens. His movements grow frantic as the air supply stops, his hands grasping behind him as he kicks upward without oxygen. Deck footage captures a crew member noticing the hose tension change. Someone shouts that Andrew is moving fast. The line is pulled in, but it goes slack. Divers rush to the rail. Underwater, Andrew drops his tools. His camera shakes violently. He releases the hose and kicks upward, but his ascent slows. The footage captures uncontrolled movement, then a sudden stillness as the camera tilts toward open water. A safety diver enters the water within moments. Andrew is reached near the bottom and brought to the surface. CPR begins immediately on deck. Emergency services were contacted at 11:26 a.m., according to dispatch logs. Despite resuscitation attempts, Andrew is pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as hypoxic asphyxia from a sudden loss of air supply. The helmet and regulators showed no internal failure. Investigators determined Andrew did not activate the bailout valve before losing consciousness. They noted that sudden air deprivation can rapidly cause confusion, air hunger, and loss of coordination, which may explain why he failed to use the emergency air supply despite his training. Inspection of the air hose revealed a deliberate partial cut that failed under pressure once underwater movement increased load on the damaged section. Investigators reviewed deck footage, compressor logs, and dive video, placing Ryan at the hose shortly before the air loss. Messages recovered from his phone showed explicit resentment toward Andrew over lost work. Mercer was arrested and later convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in California State Prison. The dive operator updated safety rules, requiring constant airline monitoring and restricted access to compressor systems. It was July 2015, in the foothills near Hinton, Alberta, where a summer adventure camp trained teenagers in survival skills and wilderness navigation. One of the camp's ridgeside trails wound through a forested slope bordered by dense spruce and shallow creeks. 28-year-old Mark Tiller had worked there for 5 years as a wilderness instructor, known for his quiet personality and skill with backcountry maintenance. That season, his co-worker Rachel Keene, 27, led most of the morning hikes and safety briefings. The two had briefly dated the year before, but broke things off when Rachel began seeing another guide. Co-workers later said Mark became distant after that. He volunteered for night patrols and took on most of the solo trail work, clearing branches or checking sensor lines that detected animal movement near camp. Some instructors remembered him joking that certain trails should just be left to the wildlife, or that a bit of noise might scare off the morning groups. Nobody took it seriously. Mark had a dry sense of humor, and long work days often ended with idle talk about bears and coyotes around the fire. By early July, camp attendance had peaked. On July 16th, the staff planned a short pre-breakfast hike for a small group of campers. Rachel led the front, followed by 2 counselors and 6 teens. The air was cool, the ground damp from overnight rain, and visibility was limited under thick tree cover. The group started along the East Ridge Trail at about 6:45 a.m. The plan was to circle toward the storage hut, where equipment for outdoor cooking was kept. As the group neared the hut, a faint beeping noise broke the morning quiet. One counselor thought it was a motion alarm. Small devices were attached to trees to track movement for wildlife studies. Before anyone could check, a deep growl echoed from behind the storage shed. A black bear, estimated at around 250 pounds, stepped out from the brush. Witnesses later said it moved toward a rope hanging near the shed, where chunks of raw meat were tied in a mesh bag. The smell had carried downwind toward the trail. Rachel told the campers to stay still and began backing away slowly. Behind her, the ground sloped downward, scattered with roots and wet leaves. She tripped and fell backward just as the bear turned toward the movement. Mark had been assigned to that section earlier in the week and was about 50 yards away on a side trail, clearing debris near the motion sensors. He froze, watching as the bear charged forward. The two counselors shouted and fired handheld flares from their belts, sending bright sparks across the clearing. The bear struck once with its paw, then retreated into the trees when the second flare ignited. Campers and staff carried Rachel back toward the main trail and radioed for help. Emergency crews arrived by helicopter within the hour, but she was pronounced dead at the scene from neck and chest injuries. Wildlife officers determined the bear had been drawn deliberately to the area. The bag of meat had been tied at shoulder height to one of the sensor lines, which were part of Mark's maintenance route. Investigators found his boot tracks near the shed and a half-empty plastic feed bucket behind a locked supply crate with traces of blood and fat residue inside. Wildlife officers later tracked and euthanized the bear 2 days after the attack, following standard protocol for fatal incidents. When questioned, Mark admitted to placing the meat but claimed it was meant for a training demonstration, not to attract an active bear. The camp's management disputed that explanation, saying no such activity was scheduled that morning. He was charged with criminal negligence causing death and violating wildlife protection laws. The Ridgeside Trail was shut down permanently after the incident. The storage hut was dismantled the following season, and the area was fenced off to prevent access. The old wooden warning sign still stands at the tree line, its yellow letters faded by weather, marking where the trail once began. It was June 18, 2017, when Molly Anderson's financial predatory behavior finally led to her brutal death in an isolated Colorado mountain cabin. The 32-year-old financial advisor had built her career on stealing from the most vulnerable members of society, but her greed would cost her everything. Molly possessed a charming personality that masked her sociopathic tendencies and complete lack of empathy for elderly victims. She specialized in targeting seniors with dementia, using her credentials to gain trust before systematically draining their life savings. 3 months earlier, Molly had targeted 78-year-old Margaret Doyle, a retired librarian living in a modest nursing home. Using forged documents and Margaret's stolen identity, Molly transferred the elderly woman's entire retirement fund into offshore accounts, leaving her unable to pay for care. Camille Doyle, Margaret's 27-year-old granddaughter, discovered the theft when the nursing home called about unpaid bills. Camille worked as a retail manager and had been Margaret's only family since her parents died. Watching her beloved grandmother cry about losing her home transformed Camille's grief into murderous rage. Camille spent months tracking down the stolen money through bank records. Her investigation led her to Molly, who had already spent Margaret's life savings on luxury cars and expensive vacations. The complete lack of remorse Molly showed when confronted fueled Camille's desire for revenge. Molly owned a remote family cabin in the Colorado mountains, located 50 miles from the nearest town. She used this isolated retreat whenever authorities began investigating her financial crimes, believing the remote location provided perfect cover. Camille learned about the cabin through surveillance and social media posts. She noted that Molly retreated there whenever she felt threatened by law enforcement, always traveling alone with no security systems or neighbors for miles. On that June evening, Molly arrived at the cabin planning to lay low until her latest investigation cooled down. She had recently stolen from 3 more elderly victims and needed time for the heat to die down. Camille had been watching the cabin for weeks, learning Molly's routines and preparing for the perfect opportunity. She waited until Molly was settled inside before making her move, knowing no one would hear the screams in the isolated wilderness. Camille confronted Molly at the cabin, presenting detailed evidence of the theft and demanding the return of her grandmother's money. When Molly laughed and claimed the elderly woman was too senile to manage money anyway, Camille's rage exploded into violence. She attacked Molly with a fireplace poker, fracturing her skull and knocking her unconscious. Camille then tied the unconscious Molly to a chair in the cabin's basement and waited for her to regain consciousness before revealing her plan for prolonged torture. Over the next several hours, Camille systematically broke Molly's fingers and toes with a hammer while forcing her to watch videos of Margaret crying about losing her home. She wanted Molly to understand the pain she had caused to innocent people. Camille used a knife to slowly carve dollar signs into Molly's arms and chest, symbolizing the money she had stolen from vulnerable seniors. Each cut was deliberate and calculated to maximize pain while keeping Molly conscious as long as possible. Molly finally died from shock and blood loss after hours of systematic torture. Her body bore evidence of Camille's methodical revenge, with dozens of cuts spelling out the word thief across her torso. Camille set fire to the cabin with Molly's body still inside, believing the flames would erase every trace of her revenge. She drove back to the city, confident that investigators would find nothing more than an accidental fire. However, forensic experts later discovered fractures in the charred remains that pointed to violent assault before death. Combined with financial records linking Camille to Molly and evidence of premeditation, the investigation built a solid case. The death was reclassified from accidental to homicide, leading to Camille's arrest for first-degree murder. It was June 19, 2017. A quiet winter evening was settling over Melbourne's outer suburbs, and the Dandenong Creek Trail had thinned out from its usual bustle of cyclists and commuters. Grace Thompson ran alone along a wooded stretch, her breath visible in the chill air, earbuds in, jacket zipped high, unaware she was running toward her final moments. Grace was a 29-year-old child welfare caseworker at a mid-sized NGO focused on family support services, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and families. Her colleagues described her as thorough and principled, qualities that had recently put her life in danger. In the months prior, Grace had submitted detailed internal reports exposing financial mismanagement by senior staff, specifically inflated travel reimbursements and grant money diverted to personal expenses. While the board took public steps toward reform, Grace privately told a friend that one board member, Darren O., had become cold and hostile, believing she had made him a target. Grace maintained a strict routine: office by 8 a.m., field visits midday, trail run after work. That Monday, she left the building at 5:12 p.m., still wearing her staff ID clipped to her pocket. The trail entrance was 5 minutes from her apartment, a familiar path she'd run hundreds of times before. At approximately 5:41 p.m., Paul Chen was jogging 60 feet behind Grace when he witnessed something that would haunt him forever. A man in a gray hoodie stepped from the brush. Paul initially thought he might be homeless until he noticed the gun in the man's hand. The man blocked Grace's path and demanded that she hand over her phone. She removed one earbud, confused, as he told her to delete the files. Grace backed away, refusing, and the man raised a small black revolver and shot her once in the abdomen at close range. She collapsed instantly onto the cold asphalt. Paul shouted and sprinted toward them, but the gunman fled into the adjacent woodland. Paul remained with Grace, who was bleeding heavily from the wound. Struggling to speak, she asked him for help as he pressed his jacket against the injury and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes. Grace was rushed to Royal Melbourne Hospital in critical condition, underwent emergency surgery, but died 2 hours later from internal bleeding. Detectives recovered CCTV footage from a nearby park entrance, showing Darren O. lingering in the area shortly before the attack. He was arrested the next morning and charged with premeditated murder. Grace's funeral was held 4 days later at a small church in Ferntree Gully, attended by family, co-workers, and several former clients who credited her with changing their lives. Her parents requested no media presence, and the service remained quiet, personal, and untelevised. In response to her death, Victoria Police launched a review of threats against whistleblowers in non-profit sectors. Officials opened a separate inquiry into the NGO's financial practices and board oversight procedures. It was May 2015 in a quiet Utah suburb, where houses lined a narrow cul-de-sac. The Whitakers lived on one side, the Clarks on the other. The driveways met in the center, separated only by a strip of shared concrete poured years before either family moved in. For months, small arguments about parking and boundaries had built into daily tension. 41-year-old John Whitaker worked construction and often parked his pickup close to the line. Across from him, Tom and Melissa Clark owned a large SUV that barely fit in their drive. Neighbors later said the problem started when Tom accidentally grazed John's truck while backing out. The scratch was small, but John treated it as deliberate. The two men argued in the street while Melissa tried to calm them down. After that day, the families barely spoke. John installed a small camera facing his driveway, and the Clarks put up a motion light. Every time one vehicle idled too long near the dividing strip, the other household took notice. On the evening of June 12th, witnesses saw John outside near dusk, pacing along the driveway and muttering about teaching the neighbors a lesson. Around 9 p.m., he carried out a 5-gallon jug of motor oil and poured it in a thin layer across the center section of concrete where the two driveways met. He later told investigators he only wanted to make the surface slippery so the Clarks would stop parking close to his truck. A light rain began just after 10 p.m., coating the neighborhood in a thin mist. The mixture of oil and water created a slick sheen that ran several feet down the incline toward the street. Around 10:40, Melissa returned from her late shift at the grocery store. Security footage from a nearby house showed her SUV's headlights turning into the cul-de-sac and backing toward the driveway. As she reversed up the incline, the tires hit the oiled patch and lost traction. The vehicle rolled backward faster than she could correct. Across the street, a neighbor on his porch saw the tail lights jerk upward as the rear end struck the retaining wall at the edge of the yard. He heard glass break, followed by a dull thud. John ran out of his house seconds later, shouting her name. He tried to open the driver's side door but slipped on the wet pavement. When police and paramedics arrived, they found the rear of the SUV crushed against the concrete lip. Melissa was still inside, unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene from blunt force injuries. Investigators noticed the heavy oil residue that still floated on the puddles along the driveway. They collected samples and later matched them to the same brand stored in John's garage. His fingerprints were found on the plastic jug left behind near the trash bin. During questioning, John first claimed he spilled the oil accidentally, then admitted to pouring it intentionally, but insisted he didn't expect anyone to get hurt. The county prosecutor charged him with criminally negligent homicide and reckless endangerment. The case drew attention locally because of its simplicity, an ordinary neighborhood dispute that escalated without warning. He was found competent to stand trial after a brief evaluation and accepted a plea agreement rather than face a full jury trial. John pleaded guilty the following year and received a 10-year sentence. The house went up for sale soon after John's conviction. Tom Clark moved out of the neighborhood within months, saying he couldn't stand seeing the spot where the crash happened. New owners later repaved the entire driveway, covering the shared strip with fresh concrete. Longtime residents still point out the faint discoloration near the edge where oil once stained the surface, a small mark left from a grudge that turned fatal. It was July 2018 in Clearwater, Florida, when the city pool opened for its busiest week of summer. Temperatures stayed near 90, and the water was crowded from morning until dusk. Two of the seasonal lifeguards, 23-year-old Ryan Geller and 22-year-old Derek Mills, had worked together since May. Both were certified instructors, quick swimmers, and known for pushing each other during training. The competition started harmlessly. Who could climb the ladder faster, who cleared the diving boards first, but soon turned personal. Supervisors noticed they timed every drill down to the second. During a mid-July rescue simulation, Ryan outperformed Derek by almost 4 seconds. The staff clapped, and one of the senior guards joked that Derek should stick to sunscreen duty. Witnesses later said Derek laughed it off, but his mood changed afterward. He started showing up early and staying late, cleaning gear and checking equipment on his own. Small arguments broke out between the two about whose rotation zone was more difficult. The final staff evaluation was set for July 21st. The city planned to promote one seasonal lifeguard to full-time for the fall swim programs. Derek knew the decision would come down to their performance in the timed rescue test. That evening, after closing, he lingered near the diving area. Surveillance later showed him kneeling beside the lifeguard lane with a bottle of oil-based sunscreen, rubbing some onto his arms, then spreading the rest across the wet deck near the rescue line. He wiped it once with a towel, leaving a slick, nearly invisible layer that blended with the water already on the tiles. The next morning, the staff gathered for drills before the pool opened. The deck was humid and slippery as usual from the early cleaning cycle. Ryan stood at his station near the deep end, waiting for the whistle that signaled the start of his timed run. Derek took the next lane over, watching. At 7:40 a.m., the supervisor blew the whistle and called a mock rescue from the diving area. Ryan sprinted forward, as he always did, crossing the same stretch of deck he used in every practice. Halfway across, his right foot slid sideways. Witnesses said his arms flailed once before he fell backward, striking the pool edge behind him. The sound echoed across the water, followed by the splash of his body sliding into the deep end. 2 guards dove in immediately, pulling him to the surface within seconds. He was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital from a severe head injury. Investigators found traces of sunscreen mixed with pool water on the deck, and later recovered the nearly empty bottle from the trash bin behind the lifeguard stand. Derek's fingerprints were identified on the cap. During questioning, he admitted spreading it as a prank and said he only wanted to make the deck extra slippery for a laugh. He was charged with manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The pool reopened weeks later with new safety flooring and a permanent sign warning staff to keep the deck dry at all times. It was November 3rd, 2015, when Jordan Whitaker's arrogant disregard for patient safety finally caught up with him. The 45-year-old cardiac surgeon had built his reputation on performing unnecessary operations for profit, but his greed would lead to his own death. Jordan possessed an ego that matched his surgical skills, viewing patients as sources of income rather than human beings. His arrogant personality made him believe he was untouchable. He routinely ignored proper procedures and took dangerous shortcuts to maximize profits. 6 months earlier, Jordan had performed a completely unnecessary cardiac procedure on Robert Anderson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who came in for routine chest pain. Despite clear evidence that medication would resolve the issue, Jordan convinced the family that immediate surgery was required. During the operation, Jordan's reckless techniques led to massive complications. Robert suffered a stroke on the operating table due to Jordan's negligent surgical methods. When Robert died 3 days later, Jordan falsified medical records to blame pre-existing conditions. Gina Anderson, Robert's 38-year-old daughter and a surgical nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, knew her father had been healthy before Jordan's unnecessary surgery. She had worked alongside Jordan for years, witnessing his dangerous practices. Her father's death transformed her grief into calculated desire for justice. Working in the same hospital gave Gina intimate knowledge of surgical procedures, medication protocols, and Jordan's personal habits. She discovered that Jordan scheduled his own routine medical procedures during off hours to avoid scrutiny from colleagues. Jordan had scheduled a private gallbladder surgery for himself, using his influence to demand it be done late at night when the hospital was nearly empty. He didn't want colleagues gossiping about his health, and his arrogance made him believe he could bend rules without consequence. At 10 p.m., he arrived for the operation, trusting Gina to prepare his anesthesia while the skeleton night crew handled other emergencies. His supreme arrogance prevented him from suspecting that the nurse whose father he had killed might seek revenge. Gina had spent months planning the perfect murder. She replaced Jordan's standard anesthesia with a lethal combination of potassium chloride and succinylcholine. The potassium would stop his heart, while the paralytic agent would prevent him from calling for help. As Jordan lay on the operating table, the anesthesiologist injected what he believed was routine pre-operative sedation. But Gina had already swapped the medication, replacing it with the lethal mix. The potassium chloride immediately began disrupting Jordan's cardiac rhythm, while the succinylcholine paralyzed his respiratory muscles, leaving him unable to breathe or call for help. Within 90 seconds, Jordan experienced complete cardiac arrest, but remained fully conscious due to the paralytic agent preventing him from speaking or moving. His brain continued functioning for approximately 4 minutes while his body was completely paralyzed. He experienced the absolute terror of conscious death, unable to move, speak, or breathe as his organs systematically shut down. His eyes remained open and aware until his brain succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Jordan, who had caused so many unnecessary deaths through his surgical arrogance, died experiencing the same helplessness his victims had felt. His body was discovered by the night shift supervisor 20 minutes later. Gina disposed of the evidence and reported finding Jordan's body during routine checks. The death was initially attributed to sudden cardiac arrest from work-related stress. However, routine toxicology reports eventually revealed the modified anesthesia cocktail. The investigation uncovered Gina's access to restricted medications and her motive. Security footage ultimately led to her arrest for premeditated murder. It was September 14th, 2015. The narrow lane behind Howrah Market buzzed with the day's final movements. Amir Ali, a 27-year-old tailor, turned off the bare bulb inside his workshop and stepped into the alley that would claim his life. Amir was just a craftsman with steady hands and a growing clientele who rented a small ground-floor unit, working long hours stitching saris, school uniforms, and cheap men's trousers. Clients described him as polite and serious, always undercharging regulars. His calloused fingers moved with practiced precision across fabric, building a modest life one stitch at a time. But 3 months earlier, everything changed. A street gang with links to a local councillor approached Amir with a proposition that would destroy his quiet existence. They demanded he help funnel campaign funds through bogus tailoring orders, a common scheme in Kolkata's political underworld. Amir refused, unwilling to compromise his integrity for dirty money. The consequences came swiftly. Posters appeared near his shop calling him a traitor to the ward. A local tea stall vendor warned him to stay careful. Friends urged him to relocate, but Amir stayed. He told neighbors he wouldn't be bullied out of the life he'd built with his own hands. That Monday afternoon, Amir worked until just past 5 o'clock. As he pulled the corrugated shutter halfway down, he waved to Sumita Sharma, a widow who lived in the next unit. She smiled and began locking her gate. Neither saw the two men waiting. Sumita heard it first. Raised voices, the scrape of metal against stone. When she stepped outside, she witnessed Amir being dragged into the narrow passage by two men in jeans and sandals. One wore a bandana over his mouth. They pinned Amir against the wall beside his sewing machine. He fought desperately, blocking the first swing of a metal rod, twisting out of their grip, but one attacker slammed the rod across Amir's shoulder, and he staggered. The second plunged a short knife into his chest. Amir fell hard onto concrete, blood spreading around his legs. The taller man struck again, this time to his skull. His body went still. Sumita screamed and ran for help. Two men from a nearby fruit stall rushed in, grabbing one attacker while the other fled. Amir lay motionless beside his broken sewing stool, blood seeping into half-stitched uniforms scattered across the floor. An ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, but Amir had already succumbed to head trauma and blood loss. His body was taken to a government hospital, then released for cremation. Neighbors left garlands and candles at the shuttered shop. Amir's funeral was held the next morning at the local mosque, attended by family, clients, and fellow artisans who quietly walked behind the hearse through the old market lanes. His sewing machine, still stained, was later moved to his parents' home in Baruipur. Within 48 hours, police confirmed the arrest of one suspect and launched a search for the second. Officials also opened a parallel investigation into the councillor's alleged ties to the extortion ring. It was December 8, 2019, when Sabrina Lowell's home-wrecking affair finally led to her death in the most brutal way imaginable. The 29-year-old real estate agent had built her career on charm and manipulation, but her greatest conquest would become her downfall when she targeted the wrong family. Sabrina possessed a narcissistic personality that thrived on stealing what belonged to others. She specialized in targeting married men, viewing their wives as obstacles rather than human beings with feelings. Her stunning looks and calculated seduction techniques had ended dozens of marriages without any remorse for the destruction she caused. Sabrina had seduced David Anderson, a successful architect married to Kelly Anderson. She systematically targeted him during house showings, using her real estate expertise to create intimate situations. She convinced him that his wife didn't appreciate him, and that he deserved someone better who understood his ambitions. Kelly Anderson, 35, had been married to David for 12 years, and was raising their twin daughters when Sabrina entered their lives like a predator. The devoted mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper to support David's career, never suspecting her husband was having an affair with their real estate agent. When David left his family, he drained their joint bank accounts and moved in with Sabrina, using their life savings. Kelly discovered the affair through credit card statements, showing expensive hotel stays and jewelry purchases. Watching her 8-year-old daughters cry themselves to sleep, asking why daddy didn't love them, transformed her grief into murderous rage. Sabrina flaunted the relationship on social media, posting photos of expensive vacations and designer gifts that David bought with his family's money. She showed no remorse for destroying a marriage and seemed to enjoy the power she held over both David and his abandoned family. The Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami had been their regular meeting place during the affair. Sabrina booked the same penthouse suite monthly, creating a romantic sanctuary where she had systematically stolen another woman's husband. Kelly learned about these getaways through private investigator reports and credit card records. On that December evening, Kelly intercepted David's phone and sent Sabrina a text asking her to meet at their usual suite. Sabrina arrived at 7 p.m. expecting a romantic evening, completely unaware that the betrayed wife had been planning this confrontation for months. Kelly was waiting when Sabrina entered with champagne and lingerie, clearly expecting to celebrate another successful manipulation. The confrontation began with Kelly calmly explaining how Sabrina's affair had destroyed her family and left her children traumatized by their father's abandonment. Sabrina showed no remorse and bragged about stealing David, claiming Kelly had been a boring wife who didn't deserve him. She laughed about the children's tears and suggested Kelly should be grateful for being freed from an unhappy marriage. The complete lack of empathy triggered something primal in Kelly. She struck Sabrina with the champagne bottle, causing her to fall and hit her head on the marble coffee table. The blow caused a severe concussion, leaving Sabrina disoriented and unable to defend herself properly. Kelly dragged the dazed Sabrina to the suite's balcony on the 20th floor, overlooking Miami's glittering skyline. She forced her against the balcony railing, gripping her shoulders tightly. Sabrina's head cleared enough to realize the danger. She struggled desperately, clawing at Kelly's hands while pleading for mercy. But Kelly was stronger, fueled by months of rage over every cruel thing Sabrina had said about the children. With one final violent shove, Kelly pushed her over the railing and let gravity do the rest. Sabrina plummeted through the night air, her screams ending when her body struck the pavement 200 feet below. Kelly cleaned the suite and escaped through the service elevator. Security initially believed Sabrina had jumped due to relationship problems. However, the investigation eventually uncovered Kelly's connection and evidence of the confrontation, leading to her arrest. It was December 3rd, 2023, in Wichita, Kansas, late on a quiet Sunday night. The apartment complex was mostly dark, with only a few windows still lit. Heat hummed through the vents. Inside one unit, a desk lamp glowed, a computer screen stayed on, and a live stream continued uninterrupted. Aaron Cole was 26 years old and worked weekdays at an IT help desk for a regional insurance company in Wichita, Kansas. His job involved routine technical support, but in the evenings, he streamed video games from his apartment to a small, steady audience. He wasn't a professional player, yet he held moderator status in several online groups, giving him control over who could join matches. One regular player was a gamer known as Rook, who had played alongside Aaron for more than a year. Chat logs later reviewed by investigators showed Aaron repeatedly criticizing Rook's performance during matches. The comments were public and personal. Missed shots were mocked, losses blamed on him, and mistakes highlighted during live streams. Weeks before the incident, the harassment escalated. During a ranked match, Aaron used his moderator privileges to remove Rook mid-game after a mistake. The ban was immediate and public. Messages afterward showed Aaron telling Rook he didn't belong in higher-level matches. Rook stopped playing but continued watching Aaron's streams. On December 3rd, Aaron entered a small online tournament streamed publicly. Rook was not playing but followed the match in chat as Aaron made repeated remarks about dead-weight teammates. After a narrow win, Aaron laughed and moved on. Minutes later, Rook sent private messages seeking to talk. Aaron did not respond. Rook went silent. Aaron continued streaming, briefly stepping away to get a drink. At 11:02 p.m., a 911 call was placed reporting an active hostage situation at Aaron's apartment. The caller claimed someone inside was armed and threatening violence. Dispatch classified it as a high-risk emergency. Officers were sent immediately. Police body cameras activated as officers arrived at the complex. They stacked outside Aaron's door and knocked loudly. Inside the apartment, the live stream audio captured Aaron's confusion. He stepped back into frame, holding his phone, asking what was happening. The knocking escalated quickly. Officers forced entry with weapons raised, as shown on body camera footage. Aaron backed into the living room, raising his hands with his phone still visible. The live stream archive captured the same moment from inside the apartment, showing him retreating with open palms as commands came from different directions. As he stepped backward toward the hallway, one of his arms moved briefly out of view near the doorway. Officers later stated they interpreted the movement as a possible reach toward a weapon. Given the high-risk dispatch classification, an officer fired a single shot. The live stream camera fell to the floor as Aaron collapsed. Video cut out, but audio continued briefly. Shouting, radio traffic, then silence. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Aaron was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as a single gunshot wound to the chest, with the round passing through the lung and heart and causing rapid, unsurvivable internal bleeding. Investigators traced the false emergency call to address spoofing software and online accounts belonging to Daniel Mendez, the individual known in gaming circles as Rook. They determined Mendez obtained Aaron's address through publicly shared details from past live streams and linked social media accounts, allowing him to place a convincing emergency call. Platform records, network activity, and preserved chat logs confirmed his identity and linked him to the call. Mendez was arrested and later convicted of making a false emergency report that resulted in death, a felony offense. He was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, with the court citing the foreseeable risk of lethal police response inherent in swatting cases. Authorities classified the incident as a fatal swatting attack. The live stream footage and police body camera recordings were preserved as evidence, and the case was later referenced by law enforcement in renewed warnings about swatting and online revenge. It was April 5, 2014. A gray Saturday evening was settling over South Bristol. Sarah Milton turned the corner toward her front door, her canvas library bag bumping softly against her hip as street lamps flickered on in the dusk. What she didn't realize was that someone had been waiting for this exact moment. Sarah wasn't the type to make enemies. The 45-year-old part-time librarian at Redfield Primary School was known for her calm, careful manner and gentle way with children. She lived alone in a modest terraced house after her divorce 3 years earlier, but remained close to her sister Claire and her 2 young nieces. Friends described her as someone who avoided confrontation and preferred the quiet company of books to the complications of adult drama. A year earlier, Sarah's peaceful world had been shattered when one of her nieces made a troubling comment during a sleepover. The 8-year-old had mentioned something inappropriate about her stepfather, Sarah's brother-in-law, Marcus Webb. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with what to do before finally reporting the incident to social services. She knew the consequences would be devastating, but protecting her niece mattered more than family harmony. The investigation that followed tore the family apart. Marcus was arrested and charged, but the case collapsed at trial due to insufficient evidence. He was acquitted after the defense successfully argued that the child's testimony was unreliable. Marcus publicly claimed his life had been ruined by false accusations, losing his job, and facing community suspicion. Privately, he blamed Sarah for destroying everything he'd built. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah tried to resume her quiet routines. She cataloged books, helped struggling readers, and maintained her professional composure. But neighbors later said she'd grown wary, double-checking locks, pausing when coming home after dark, glancing over her shoulder more frequently. The family rift had left her isolated, cut off from her sister who'd chosen to believe her husband's denials. That Saturday evening, Sarah had stayed late at the school library, organizing new arrivals for Monday's classes. By the time she reached her block, dusk had settled and a light drizzle had begun. As she approached her porch, she noticed a figure in a gray hoodie lingering near the bus stop. She hesitated, keys in hand, but the man didn't move. Reassuring herself it was nothing, she unlocked her front door. According to eyewitness Emma Hayes, who lived across the street, the figure crossed the road at a jog and reached Sarah's door within seconds. Before Sarah could close it behind her, the man raised a small handgun and fired twice through the narrow opening. The shots echoed through the quiet neighborhood. One bullet struck Sarah's chest, the other her face. She fell backwards through the doorway. Emma watched in horror as the shooter shoved Sarah's body with his foot, sending her tumbling down the short porch steps to land face first on the concrete. Emma screamed and dialed emergency services while her teenage son waited for the man to leave before running across the street with a towel, desperately trying to compress the bleeding. Another neighbor brought a blanket, but Sarah was already beyond help. She never regained consciousness. Police arrived within 7 minutes, but paramedics declared Sarah dead at the scene. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as massive head trauma and a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. Within 48 hours, officers arrested Marcus Webb at a flat in Bedminster, where they recovered clothing matching Emma's description, and a handgun later confirmed to match the ballistic evidence from the scene. Gunshot residue was also found on Webb's hands, though investigators noted its limited evidentiary value compared to the ballistic match. Sarah Milton's funeral was held the following Friday at St. Luke's Church, just blocks from the school where she'd worked. Dozens of children, parents, and former colleagues attended, placing daisies and paper cranes beside her casket. In the days that followed, authorities confirmed that Marcus Webb would face charges for murder and firearm possession. The trial began 6 months later, but for Sarah Milton, justice would come too late. It was March 14, 2017 in Toronto, Canada. The mid-afternoon sun filtered weakly through the high windows of North Bay Fitness. The gym hummed with the usual clatter of plates and murmurs of conversation, but the result of personal grudges was about to escalate horribly. Marcus Hilliard, 32, worked as a personal trainer and competed in amateur powerlifting circuits across Ontario. He was disciplined and highly focused in his training, but had a confrontational streak, particularly with former peers who challenged his reputation. Outside the gym, Marcus trained clients in strict schedules and maintained meticulous records of lifts, nutrition, and recovery. Friends noted that he reacted aggressively to criticism. He prided himself on resilience, rarely stepping aside in disputes, and had recently clashed with a former training partner, Corbin Lefroy, over competition results, with their rivalry simmering privately and publicly for weeks. That afternoon, Corbin arrived at North Bay Fitness during peak hours. Marcus was overseeing a client near the free weight section when verbal provocation began. Over 10 minutes, witnesses saw and heard escalating insults and threats, the atmosphere growing tense as other gym-goers paused their routines. Security cameras captured the exchange, showing both men gesturing angrily and stepping closer with each rebuttal. Despite staff attempts to intervene verbally, the confrontation intensified. The gym was crowded, and the space near the barbells was narrow, with minimally cushioned flooring around the lifting area, creating a slip hazard. Marcus's posture shifted defensively, his focus divided between his client and the aggression of Corbin. His previous experience in high-pressure competition gave him confidence, but it also contributed to underestimating the immediate physical risk. Suddenly, Corbin lifted a barbell loaded with plates totaling approximately 110 pounds from the rack and swung it in a controlled but powerful arc toward Marcus's head. Witnesses described the motion as swift and deliberate. Marcus staggered back, attempting to shield himself, but his feet slipped on the worn floor mat and he fell. The barbell connected with the side of his skull, driving him to the ground where he struck the hard gym floor with full force. The impact caused immediate loss of consciousness. For several seconds, Corbin just stood there, likely due to shock, before dropping the bar and sitting against the nearest wall, appearing dazed rather than enraged. Bystanders and gym staff rushed to assist, applying first aid and beginning CPR within 2 minutes of collapse, while emergency medical services were contacted. The CCTV footage showed Marcus lying motionless, limbs splayed, with rapid but ineffective compressions applied by staff. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and assessed massive cranial trauma, including a depressed skull fracture and extensive cerebral hemorrhage, making resuscitation impossible despite immediate intervention. Post-mortem examination confirmed blunt force trauma to the cranium, with a depressed skull fracture and subdural hematoma. The detailed analysis indicated that the impact location and force from the barbell, combined with the secondary floor impact, rendered survival impossible, even with rapid medical response. When another member shouted that police had arrived, Corbin made no attempt to flee and remained seated. Police reviewed the gym's security footage and arrested Corbin Lefroy immediately. In court, Corbin pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming the assault followed weeks of escalating tension over alleged harassment and verbal provocation. Psychological evaluations described him as remorseful, with no prior record of violence. He was sentenced to 8 years in a medium-security correctional facility in Ontario, eligible for parole after 5. It was March 22, 2016, when Blake Thornton's reckless disregard for human life finally led to his own violent death on a dark Tennessee highway. The 28-year-old came from a wealthy family whose connections had repeatedly saved him from facing real consequences for his dangerous behavior. Blake worked as a trust fund manager at his family's investment firm. His privileged upbringing had created an arrogant personality that viewed rules as suggestions for lesser people. He treated his multiple DUI arrests as minor inconveniences. Exactly 1 year earlier, Blake had been driving drunk when he struck and killed 6-year-old Emma Lowell in a crosswalk outside her elementary school. The little girl was walking home when Blake's speeding BMW sent her small body flying 30 feet through the air. He fled the scene immediately. Trina Lowell, Emma's 34-year-old mother, watched her only child take her final breath in the hospital that night. The single mother had devoted her entire life to raising Emma. Blake's wealthy family hired expensive lawyers who got him probation, claiming the child had darted into traffic. The injustice consumed Trina completely. She quit her job as a dental hygienist and spent the entire year studying Blake's patterns. She learned he visited Murphy's Tavern every Tuesday night, always leaving around 11:30 p.m. completely intoxicated. His route home took him down Highway 67, a winding mountain road. Trina spent months obsessing over revenge. Online forums and repair manuals taught her how cars worked, and she practiced on junkyard wrecks until her hands moved with mechanical precision. For weeks, Trina followed Blake to Murphy's Tavern parking lot, waiting until he was inside drinking before sliding beneath his silver BMW. She studied every inch of the undercarriage, rehearsing exactly where and how to strike. That fatal Tuesday night, while Blake was inside bragging about beating another DUI charge, Trina made her move. She slipped behind the front wheel well and severed the brake line with one precise cut, deep enough to ensure total failure but hidden well enough to pass a casual glance. At 11:30 p.m., Blake stumbled to his car, completely unaware that his vehicle had just been transformed into a death trap by a grieving mother seeking justice. At mile marker 23, Blake approached the sharp curve where he had previously crashed without consequence. This time, when he pressed the brake pedal, it sank uselessly to the floor. The severed brake line left him with no stopping power, and the BMW carried its full speed straight toward the guardrail at 55 miles per hour. Blake yanked the wheel desperately, but the heavy car barely responded. With no way to slow down, the vehicle plowed through the metal guardrail and became airborne over the 150-foot embankment. For 3 terrifying seconds, Blake experienced the same helplessness his victim had felt. The BMW flipped 3 times down the rocky slope. Blake's body was thrown violently around the interior as windows exploded and the roof collapsed. During the second flip, his neck snapped against the doorframe, instantly paralyzing him. Blake remained conscious but unable to move as gasoline leaked from the ruptured fuel tank. Broken glass had shredded his face and arms, while twisted metal pinned his legs. He could smell the gas fumes growing stronger. Blake lay trapped and paralyzed, his broken neck and massive internal injuries stealing his strength within minutes. In those final moments, he finally understood the terror his victim had experienced. He slipped into unconsciousness from blood loss before death claimed him. Trina had been visiting Emma's grave during the crash, establishing a perfect alibi. The investigation initially ruled it another drunk driving accident. However, forensic analysis eventually revealed the mechanical sabotage, leading investigators to Trina. It was November 2016 in rural Pennsylvania. The air around the small hillside cemetery stayed damp after a week of rain, and puddles filled the gravel paths between rows of graves. The caretaker, James Holloway, had worked there for 15 years. People in town said no one trimmed grass straighter than him. But that fall, things changed. The cemetery hired a younger man named Darren Lutz as the new head groundsman. Darren had only been there 3 years but was good with reports and safety paperwork. When James got written up for missing logs, he lost his title. Those who knew him said James took it hard. He kept doing his job, mowing and cleaning, but stopped talking to most of the crew. Over time, he started showing up after dark, saying he wanted to finish tasks when no one else was around. It wasn't unusual. The small crew often left the gate keys under the office mat for him, and nobody questioned his habits. The cemetery's new burial section sat downhill near the back fence, supported by a retaining wall that held back soft hillside soil. After several days of rain, water had pooled behind that wall. Darren, now the supervisor, wanted to inspect it for pressure cracks before the weekend. The night before, James was seen walking near that same area with a toolbox. He told a neighbor he was patching erosion. In truth, he had loosened several bolts along the wall's lower row. Most were half buried under clay, so the tampering wasn't visible unless the soil was cleared away. His plan, according to later reports, wasn't to cause a collapse, only to make the wall shift enough to startle Darren. That morning, Darren parked his truck close to the slope to keep his radio in range. The signal often dropped near the fence line. He carried a probe to test the surface and began checking each section. 2 women visiting relatives' graves said they saw him crouching near the center of the wall, speaking into his radio. Moments later, a cracking sound cut through the quiet. The limestone face bowed forward and buckled. A heavy wave of wet clay and rock spilled out, sweeping Darren off his feet and covering him completely. One witness ran toward the main office for help, while the other tried digging with a flower vase from a nearby headstone, but the soil packed too fast. Maintenance staff reached the site minutes later, but the area was unstable. The wall had folded inward, leaving only a section of Darren's jacket visible. Rescue teams worked carefully over the next 2 days, removing the soil by hand to prevent another collapse. When investigators examined the frame, they found several missing bolts and fresh wrench marks on the remaining supports. James didn't return to work after that day. His house was found empty, his truck gone, and his paycheck still uncollected. Police never located the missing bolts or his toolbox. Some believed he panicked and fled. Others thought he'd planned it all along. The cemetery reopened weeks later with a new concrete wall built under county supervision. The area where the collapse happened was leveled and turned into open lawn, no longer used for burials. Locals still remember James Holloway as the quiet man who kept the grass perfect. His old push mower still sits in the shed, blades rusted but lined up neatly, just the way he used to leave things. It was June 18, 2016 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, at a mountain zipline park during peak summer hours. The air was warm. Lines extended beyond the shaded platforms. Guides called out group numbers. Harnesses clinked against metal rails, and phones were raised as visitors waited, filmed, and talked over the constant hum of activity. Lena Whitaker was 22 years old, a college student from Kentucky visiting Pigeon Forge with 3 friends after finishing summer classes. She worked part-time at a campus bookstore and paid for short trips by taking extra weekend shifts. She had no background in extreme sports and wasn't filming for social media. The group chose the zipline park because it was nearby, affordable, and advertised as beginner-friendly. What most visitors didn't know was that Lena had a prior connection to one of the park's seasonal employees. Derek Hall, 29, worked on the zipline crew that summer, handling gear staging and harness rotation between groups. Years earlier, Derek and Lena attended the same high school. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that Lena had been part of a group that repeatedly mocked and humiliated him during that time. The encounters were not physical, but persistent. Former classmates described Derek as withdrawn afterward, while Lena moved on without consequences. The park operated multiple zipline runs across a wooded slope above a rocky ravine. Riders wore full-body harnesses clipped to a cable trolley, and guides followed a fixed routine. selecting a harness, tightening straps, performing a brief visual and tug check, then signaling the launch. During peak hours, equipment was cycled rapidly with little idle time. That afternoon, staff logs and security footage showed Derek Hall lingering near the equipment rack, despite not being assigned to that station. Cameras recorded him removing a spare harness, turning it inward, and handling the waste assembly out of view before returning it to the rack. About 10 minutes later, Lena's group reached the front. A guide selected the compromised harness, placed it on Lena, tightened the straps, and clipped her into the line. From bystander phone footage, the checks appear routine. Hands-on webbing, quick tug, then clearance to launch. No visible issue was apparent. Lena stepped off the platform and rolled smoothly onto the cable. Security footage showed her traveling normally across the first span, legs bent, posture stable. She crossed above the open air toward the center of the ravine. Mid-line, as Lena reached the lowest point of the cable span, the trolley jolted slightly, causing a sudden spike in force that tore the already compromised strap completely. Security footage shows her body drop abruptly. The bystander's phone captured cheering breaking into shouting as she fell from the line. She struck rock and compacted soil approximately 70 feet below. Operations halted immediately as staff cleared the remaining riders from the platforms and contacted emergency services. The county medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force trauma resulting from a fall from height. Inspection of the harness confirmed deliberate sabotage. Investigators determined that a primary load-bearing belay loop had been deliberately cut to the point of structural failure, consistent with the use of a blade rather than material fatigue or a manufacturing defect. Security footage from behind the staging platform showed Derek Hall handling the same spare harness minutes before it was issued, despite not being assigned to that station. Staff logs and supervisor statements confirmed he had unsupervised access to the equipment rack during that window. Hall was arrested later that evening and formally charged with first-degree murder and tampering with safety equipment. During a recorded interview, he admitted to sabotaging the harness and told investigators the act was motivated by long-standing resentment, tied to repeated humiliation he experienced during high school. He was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities classified the death as a targeted homicide carried out using his workplace access. The park permanently closed the affected zip line, removed spare harnesses from public access, and revised equipment handling protocols. Investigators described the incident as rare and isolated. It was November 18, 2016 in Manchester, England. A damp, cold night settled over the city, the streets slick with recent rain. Inside a quiet duplex complex, a personal betrayal was about to turn lethal, not through accident but through deliberate rage. Clara Winslow, 28, worked as a freelance graphic designer from her apartment, producing digital content for regional clients and occasional European brands. Just a week earlier, she had ended a 2-year relationship with Ronan Blackwood after he discovered she had been seeing someone else. Friends later described the breakup as volatile. They cited one confrontation outside her building that ended with police being called but no charges filed. Her apartment was modestly furnished, with equipment and electronics positioned around the living space, including a workstation in the corner and a mattress by the window for natural light. She often stayed up late completing design work, leaving windows slightly ajar for ventilation and to let in the city's ambient light. She had refused to install additional security measures beyond basic locks, believing situational awareness was sufficient. While technically mindful of risk, she underestimated human threats in her immediate environment. That night, Ronan returned to the complex. Neighbors had reported him loitering in previous evenings after arguments regarding shared property and personal items. Carrying a bottle of gasoline, he approached Clara's ground floor window, partially ajar for ventilation. A neighbor's private security camera captured a crouching figure at the window frame. The liquid container visible in hand, scene reconstruction reports detailed that Clara, unaware of the approaching danger, was likely completing work at her computer, headphones in, leaving her oblivious to external sounds. Ronan poured the gasoline across the mattress and nearby bedding, then ignited it with a lighter. Flames spread almost instantly across the synthetic fibers due to vapors in the confined space. rapidly climbing toward the window frame and nearby furniture. Smoke began filling the room almost immediately. Although some smoke escaped through the slightly open window, the ceiling height and clutter allowed dense smoke to accumulate near the floor, disorienting Clara. Evidence showed that Clara attempted to exit her bedroom, but shadows and smoke made doors and obstacles difficult to discern, complicating her escape. Neighbors heard persistent coughing and pounding on her bedroom door, but were unable to break it down before the fire's intensity caused localized ceiling plaster and timber above the mattress to collapse, further blocking potential egress. Firefighters arrived within 6 minutes of the alarm, but initial entry was slowed by heat and debris, forcing entry to find Clara unresponsive amid thick smoke and intense heat. She still had a faint pulse when pulled from the room, and was immediately transferred by ambulance to Manchester Royal Infirmary, where she was treated for severe smoke inhalation and burns. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was declared dead less than 2 hours later. Post-incident analysis confirmed the fire had originated on the mattress near the window, accelerated by liquid fuel, with rapid thermal propagation consistent with an accelerant. Evidence from neighbor cameras and fire debris corroborated the timeline and sequence of events, confirming no accidental cause. Coroner's report listed cause of death as mixed smoke inhalation and thermal burns, noting extensive soot in the airway and lungs and burns consistent with rapid room fire. Ronan Blackwood was arrested the following day, after footage and witness statements were cross-referenced. Manchester City Council fire inspectors required a formal assessment before repairs could proceed, and the complex implemented additional safety measures, including updated smoke alarms and door security. It was August 17, 2013. Apodaca's industrial sprawl stretched across the outskirts of Monterrey, where workers at a small vehicle depot lingered past closing time. Alejandro Alex Flores stood beneath a street lamp, chatting with two co-workers about weekend plans. What they didn't know was that Alex's quiet resistance over the past few months had reached its breaking point. Alex was a 32-year-old school bus mechanic. He was known for being organized, punctual, and soft-spoken. He'd worked the same job for 8 years, maintaining the yellow buses that carried children through San Nicolas. His modest house sat on a quiet street where he lived with his wife Maria and their 2 children, ages 6 and 4. Friends described him as a man who kept his head down and took care of his family, exactly the kind of person who should have been left alone. When a local gang began demanding weekly protection fees from neighborhood businesses, Alex made a decision that would cost him everything. He refused to pay, believing that giving in meant permanent entanglement with criminals who would never stop asking for more. Over the following weeks, he filed quiet complaints with police, submitting license plates and descriptions anonymously. There was no formal protection program, just vague promises of follow-up that never materialized. Days went on and the threats escalated. Gang members began mentioning his family by name, asking about his children's school schedule. Alex confided in close friends, but still showed up to work every day, hoping the situation would resolve itself. That evening, as the shop lights dimmed and his co-workers smoked cigarettes on the curb, Alex looked more tense than usual. He'd recently learned from a neighbor that strangers had been asking questions about his kids. At 7:45 in the evening, 2 men approached from the end of the street. According to eyewitness Jose Ruiz, one wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. The other had a bandana masking his features. They walked with purpose but didn't run, closing the distance quickly. When they were within arm's reach, the hooded man said plainly that it was for not paying, and before Alex could react, he drew a short blade from his waistband and lunged. Alex turned to run but managed only 2 steps before the attacker slashed his neck from behind. He stumbled forward and collapsed into the gutter, one hand gripping his throat as blood poured. Jose shouted and rushed forward as the second man delivered a vicious kick to Alex's ribs. Both assailants fled down the narrow alley, disappearing into the maze of industrial buildings. Jose knelt beside his co-worker, desperately trying to compress the wound while another mechanic ran for shop rags and called for help. Within minutes, Alex's breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, but it was far too late. Alex had bled out, the fatal wound a deep slash across the side of his neck. Surveillance footage from a nearby warehouse captured part of the attack, providing investigators with critical evidence. Using Jose's detailed description, police arrested 2 suspects in early September, both low-level gang members under 25. Alex's second cousin arranged a private funeral in Monterrey, attended by family and co-workers who remembered him as a good man who'd simply tried to do the right thing. The local press ran a brief story in the crime section. Mechanic killed over extortion refusal. No larger investigation followed. The garage reopened 2 days later, and life continued as if Alex Flores had never existed. It was November 2014 in Alberta, Canada. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thin ice lined the edges of Highway 22 between Turner Valley and Black Diamond. Constable Ryan Burke, 33, had driven that route for 6 years. Locals knew his patrol car and often waved when he passed. He had a steady reputation, calm with drivers, more likely to issue warnings than tickets. His approach made him well-liked in the small towns spread along the foothills. 2 years earlier, Ryan had been part of a routine stop that ended badly. A wanted suspect resisted arrest, and the chase ended with a crash and a fatal gunfire exchange. Ryan hadn't fired the shot, but he'd been there when the man's brother was taken into custody. The case was closed and the report cleared him. Yet people who followed local news remembered his name. Over time, he went back to quiet patrols, checking speeders, helping with breakdowns, and watching for wildlife that crossed the road after dusk. On November 21st, a little after 9 p.m., the radio logged Ryan's call about a pickup with its hazard lights on near the old bridge curve. He told dispatch he'd check it out before heading back to the detachment. Dashcam footage, later reviewed by investigators, shows the moment his cruiser pulled behind the truck. The flashing lights of his bar reflected against the rear window of the pickup. Ryan stepped out, shining his flashlight toward the driver's side. The road was nearly empty, just distant headlights miles away. Seconds later, the dash cam captured a brief flare and a low popping sound, softer than a normal gunshot because of the wind. The picture jolted, then the camera tilted sideways as the unit hit the pavement. The lens kept recording from the ground, showing the pickup speeding away northbound. A traffic cone caught under its rear tire. A motorist traveling south saw the police lights flicker, then fade. He slowed and noticed the patrol car's door open with no one inside. When he called emergency dispatch, the operator confirmed that no units were expected at that location. Officers and paramedics reached the scene within minutes, finding Ryan near the shoulder beside the vehicle, his radio still clipped to his jacket. He was unresponsive and was taken to the nearest hospital in Black Diamond, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators confirmed he had been struck once in the upper chest at close range. Witnesses at 2 nearby gas stations later described a man who'd been asking questions that week about the officer who killed his brother. One attendant remembered him filling gas cans and driving a gray pickup with mismatched panels. The description matched the vehicle seen in the dashcam. The case remained open for several months, handled by regional and federal teams. Despite searches through nearby properties and vehicle records, the man seen at local gas stations was never found. The abandoned pickup was traced to a junkyard purchase under a false name. The patrol unit was later retired from service, and that section of Highway 22 was added to a list of high-risk stops for single-officer patrols. It was February 14th, 2017, when Cameron Doyle's manipulative nature finally caught up with her in the most horrific way imaginable. The 29-year-old wedding photographer had built her reputation on capturing perfect moments, but behind the lens lurked a woman who thrived on destroying the very love she pretended to celebrate. Cameron specialized in high-end weddings along California's coast, using her access to intimate moments to gather compromising information about her clients. Her calculating personality and sharp eye for human weakness made her a master blackmailer. She would photograph guests in compromising positions, capture private conversations, and fabricate evidence when reality didn't serve her purposes. Jake Johnson had been one of her victims. The 32-year-old landscape architect hired Cameron to photograph his engagement party 8 months earlier, never suspecting she would use doctored images to convince his fiancée that he was cheating. The lies destroyed everything Blake held dear: his relationship, his unborn child, and his faith in humanity. While Cameron celebrated another successful manipulation, Blake's world crumbled. His fiancée left, taking their baby, and Blake spiraled into depression and unemployment. But grief transformed into something darker as he began planning his revenge. Cameron maintained a Valentine's Day tradition of visiting Mendocino's cliffside rose garden alone, photographing herself with a single red rose against the sunset. She posted about this ritual extensively on social media, never realizing she was providing Blake with the perfect opportunity. the garden perched 300 feet above jagged rocks and crashing Pacific waves. Blake knew Cameron would arrive at 5:30 p.m., just as she had every February 14th for the past 5 years. He waited in the maze of pathways, watching as she posed with her rose near the cliff's edge. When Blake emerged from the shadows, Cameron initially didn't recognize the broken man whose life she had destroyed. He calmly explained who he was and what her lies had cost him. Cameron's arrogant dismissal quickly turned to panic as she realized the danger. She attempted to flee toward the garden entrance, but Blake blocked her path. During the violent struggle, Cameron dropped her rose as Blake grabbed her wrist. In a moment of pure rage, he shoved her backward with both hands. Cameron stepped back, and the loose soil at the cliff's edge crumbled beneath her feet. She plunged the full 300 feet down the rocky cliff face, her body striking multiple granite outcroppings before crashing onto the rocks below. The devastating impact shattered her ribs and fractured her skull, killing her instantly. Hours later, rescuers found her broken body on the rocks, the red rose lying beside her in the debris. The scene initially appeared to be an accidental fall during a photography session. However, investigators eventually uncovered Jake's connection to Cameron and evidence of premeditation. The case revealed the dark side of Cameron's photography business and the lives she had destroyed through her manipulations. Jake was arrested for first-degree murder, though he maintained that justice had finally been served for all of Cameron's victims. The investigation uncovered at least 12 other couples, whose relationships Cameron had deliberately sabotaged for her own twisted entertainment and financial gain. It was February 18, 2017, in Riverside, California, on a Saturday evening at a neighborhood recreation center. The gym was crowded for a weekly pickup basketball league. Shoes squeaked across the court. The scoreboard buzzed between possessions, and phones were propped against bleachers to record highlights. From the outside, it was just another competitive game. Marcus Lee was 27 years old and worked as a delivery supervisor for a regional logistics company. He played basketball 3 nights a week and treated pickup games like organized competition. Teammates described him as aggressive on defense and physical under the rim. He used his body often, boxing out hard, setting moving screens, and throwing elbows when fighting for position. Complaints had been made before, but games usually continued. Jason Morales, 26, worked as a junior electrician and had played against Marcus for over a year. They knew each other by name. Their matchups were tense. During several games, Marcus had bumped Jason mid-air or driven his shoulder into him while cutting to the basket. 2 weeks earlier, during a rebound scramble, Marcus's elbow caught Jason above the eye. Gym CCTV recorded Jason leaving the court bleeding from a cut eyebrow that later required stitches. Witnesses said Marcus waved it off as accidental. On the night of the incident, both men were on opposing teams. The game was fast and close. Jason guarded Marcus tightly, avoiding contact early. Marcus continued playing physically, backing into defenders and using his arms to create space. At one point, Jason complained to teammates that Marcus was continuing the same physical behavior from previous games. No official referees were present, only a scorekeeper. Midway through the second half, CCTV above the backboard shows Marcus driving on a fast break. Jason trails him closely. As Marcus jumps for a dunk, Jason closes in and forcefully extends both hands into Marcus's lower back while he's airborne. The push shifts Marcus forward mid-jump. He misses the rim, and his head snaps back, striking an unpadded metal support arm behind the backboard, part of an older hoop assembly. The impact is loud and sharp. Marcus drops straight down onto the court. A phone video from the bleachers captures players stopping and shouting as blood begins pooling near his head. Jason steps back toward the baseline as others wave for help. The gym calls 911 at 8:42 p.m. Paramedics arrive within minutes and attempt stabilization on the court. Marcus shows no meaningful response and is transported to a nearby hospital, where he is pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as traumatic brain injury caused by a high-force impact with a fixed metal structure. Police reviewed gym CCTV and phone videos, confirming Jason's hands extended into Marcus while he was airborne. Witnesses described ongoing tension between the two men, including a prior elbow injury captured on earlier footage. Messages recovered from Jason's phone referenced resentment over Marcus's physical style of play. Jason Morales was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter. He was later convicted and sentenced to 11 years in California State Prison, with the court citing the retaliatory nature of the shove and the extreme risk created by pushing an airborne player toward a fixed metal structure. The recreation center suspended pickup basketball leagues, upgraded hoop padding to cover exposed support arms, and revised safety policies to limit physical contact during unsupervised games. It was October 22, 2014, in Lyon, France. The evening air was cool and crisp, with the streets quiet as autumn shadows lengthened. In a well-appointed apartment in the Croix-Rousse district, a convivial dinner was underway. But behind the polished silverware and carefully arranged candles, something was about to transform hospitality into tragedy. Isabelle Chevalier, 52, owned a small but respected bistro in central Lyon, known for her curated wine selection and seasonal menus. She had spent decades cultivating her reputation as both chef and sommelier, often attending regional tastings and representing local producers at culinary events. She prided herself on her knowledge of French gastronomy and hosting elegant dinners that doubled as networking opportunities for restaurateurs and wine merchants. Isabelle's professional experience extended to handling ingredients safely, understanding toxicological risks, and overseeing kitchen operations with precision. While confident in her culinary skills, Isabelle could not anticipate malicious intent from a guest who had a prior unresolved dispute with her over a wine shipment contract. That night, Isabelle prepared a shared dessert for the guests, unaware that one attendee had secretly introduced awabine, a potent cardiotoxic glycoside, into the dish. The gathering included acquaintances from the culinary community, each engaged in light conversation, sampling wine, and enjoying the meticulously prepared meal. Isabelle consumed the dessert with enthusiasm, commenting on the texture and balance, a routine she'd performed countless times during tasting. Small signs, the slight bitterness at the edges of the dessert, went unremarked, masked by the dark chocolate ganache. The dessert had been carefully portioned to ensure only Isabelle ingested a lethal dose. Within 45 minutes, Isabelle started having severe stomach cramps, dizziness, blurry vision, and her heart rate slowed dangerously. Guests immediately noticed her pallor and unsteady movements, attempting to guide her to a chair. Despite first aid efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Calls were made to emergency services and paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, finding her semi-conscious and in extreme distress. Heart rate was erratic, blood pressure collapsed, and neurological function impaired, consistent with potent cardiotoxic exposure. ECG monitoring showed severe arrhythmia, and paramedics initiated advanced life support measures, including oxygen, IV access, and cardiac monitoring. Guests attempted assisted respiration and monitored vitals as emergency responders transported her to the hospital. During the drive, Isabelle's condition worsened. She lost consciousness en route, and resuscitation attempts at the hospital failed. Witnesses reported her skin turning pale and cyanotic, pupils dilated, and absence of coordinated breathing. Footage from private security cameras confirmed she had ingested the dessert in its entirety, with no other obvious contributing factors present in the apartment. Medical staff confirmed that the awabane fatally disrupted cardiac rhythm and neurological function. Post-mortem examination determined acute awabane poisoning, a highly cardiotoxic glycoside, caused systemic cardiovascular failure, with toxicology measuring lethal levels in blood, stomach contents, and liver tissue. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Police collected remaining food samples and interviewed attendees, resulting in a confession from the responsible individual. Within a week, French authorities arrested Julien Marchand, the guest responsible, and he was charged with premeditated murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, with additional fines and a prohibition from working in food service. An accomplice who aided in concealing the poison received a shorter sentence of 10 years. It was August 15, 2018, when Renee Callister's childhood cruelty finally caught up with her. The 31-year-old marketing executive had built a successful career, but her polished exterior concealed the heart of a vicious bully who had never faced consequences for the psychological torture she inflicted on vulnerable children. Renee possessed a narcissistic personality that made her incapable of genuine empathy. Even as an adult, she viewed others as objects for her entertainment, dismissing the pain she caused with casual indifference. Her social media showcased a perfect life, filled with luxury vacations and designer clothes, funded by her ruthless corporate tactics. 20 years earlier, at Camp Wildwood, Renee had been the ringleader of systematic abuse against Jordan Whitaker. The shy 12-year-old became her favorite target, enduring daily humiliation that included being forced to eat garbage, having his belongings destroyed, and being locked in storage closets for hours. Renee's cruelty drove Jordan to write a suicide note, though he never followed through. Jordan Whitaker, now 33, had spent decades in therapy recovering from the trauma Renee inflicted. The former victim worked as a property caretaker for the county, which gave him access to the abandoned Camp Wildwood. While Renee thrived in her corporate world, Jordan struggled with depression and anxiety that stemmed directly from her childhood torture. The camp had been closed for 15 years, its buildings slowly rotting in the wilderness. Jordan maintained the property, walking daily through the locations where his innocence had been destroyed. He kept his childhood suicide note as a reminder of how close Renee had pushed him to the edge. Renee's Instagram posts revealed her plan to visit the old camp for a nostalgic photo shoot. She wanted to recreate childhood memories for her lifestyle blog, completely oblivious to the pain those memories represented. Jordan saw this as divine justice finally presenting itself after 2 decades of waiting. On that August afternoon, Renee arrived alone at 2 p.m., her expensive camera equipment contrasting sharply with the decaying surroundings. She posed cheerfully in locations where she had once tormented children, treating the abandoned camp like a backdrop for social media content. Jordan emerged from the old dining hall, carrying his childhood suicide note. When he confronted her with the evidence of what her cruelty had nearly caused, Renee's reaction was everything Jordan expected. She laughed, dismissing their childhood interactions as harmless fun while showing zero remorse. Her complete lack of remorse triggered something primal in Jordan. 20 years of suppressed rage exploded as he chased her through the rotting camp buildings toward the old rope course, where she had once pushed him off platforms and cut his safety ropes for entertainment. Renee became entangled in deteriorated rope obstacles 30 feet above the ground. The equipment was now a death trap of frayed cables and rotting wood. Jordan stood below, watching as Renee begged for help, while he recited every cruel thing she had done to him and other vulnerable children. The rope finally snapped. Renee plummeted 30 feet onto broken wooden posts that had once supported camp signs. One pierced through her abdomen while another fractured her spine, paralyzing her instantly. She remained conscious for only minutes, experiencing a brief but intense moment of helplessness she had once inflicted on others, before succumbing to massive blood loss. Jordan left her body at the camp and reported finding her the next day during his routine inspection. The investigation initially supported accidental death, but Jordan's connection to Renee eventually led to his arrest for murder. It was February 2018 on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. A small roadside motel sat just off the highway, a narrow building with faded paint and a flickering vacancy sign that buzzed through the night. It wasn't much, but it stayed busy enough with travelers and truck drivers passing through. The manager, 29-year-old Sophie Dalton, handled nearly everything herself. She lived in a small room behind the front desk, working long hours to keep the place running. Most nights she balanced the books, checked cameras, and made sure the laundry room finished before dawn. For several months, the motel had dealt with a troublesome tenant named Leonard Price. He was in his 40s and had rented one of the end units, paying weekly in cash. At first, he kept to himself, but later guests complained about loud music and shouting. Sophie warned him several times before evicting him for unpaid rent and repeated disturbances. Employees later said he didn't take it well. After being kicked out, he parked near the property on several nights, watching the front office from his truck. before driving off when the lights turned off. The motel had an old boiler system that heated water for all the rooms. It sat inside a small utility wing behind the laundry area, next to the janitor's closet. Leonard had helped repair it months earlier, tightening a few fittings when the system leaked during the winter. It worked fine after that, though no licensed technician ever inspected his work. Sophie sometimes joked that the motel held together mostly out of luck. On the night of February 9th, the temperature had dropped into the mid-30s. Sophie stayed up late finishing the night audit, a routine check of cash receipts and online bookings, while the janitor mopped the hallway. Around 11 p.m., 2 guests were outside smoking near the parking lot, facing the utility wing. They later told investigators they heard a sharp hiss, followed by a heavy metallic thump. Seconds later, the steel door to the boiler room bulged outward and blew off its hinges. The explosion sent scalding steam and hot water flooding into the narrow hallway. One of the smokers, a man from room 7, ran toward the building when he heard shouting. Through the steam, he saw Sophie trying to reach the front door. He pulled her partway into the lobby, but she collapsed before they made it outside. The janitor escaped through the laundry exit with minor burns. The witnesses called 911 as alarms in the office, and nearby rooms began to beep from the sudden heat. Firefighters arrived within minutes, shutting down the remaining gas lines and ventilating the wing. The boiler tank had ruptured near its base, splitting along a welded seam. Investigators later found that the safety relief valve, designed to vent excess pressure, had been tightened fully shut. Threads on the valve showed tool marks that matched a wrench, suggesting deliberate tampering. Records confirmed that Leonard Price was the last person to perform any repairs on that boiler before his eviction. The damage to the building was extensive. Ceiling panels in the hallway had peeled from the heat, and sections of the wall framing were warped from the pressure wave. Sophie was taken to a Reno hospital but died shortly after arrival from severe burns and inhalation injuries. The janitor told police he had seen Leonard's truck parked near the service road less than an hour before the blast. Detectives located Leonard 3 days later at a relative's property near Carson City. He was arrested without incident after neighbors reported a pickup matching the motel's surveillance photo parked in the driveway. Investigators recovered burned work clothes and a set of tools consistent with those used on the boiler. During questioning, Leonard denied involvement, but could not explain why the safety valve showed fresh wrench marks matching his equipment. He was later charged with second-degree murder and arson resulting in death. The trial concluded the following year, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The motel closed temporarily after the incident. Renovations began that summer under new management, replacing the entire heating system with modern units. When the building reopened the next year, the room numbers had been changed. Units 12 through 15, where the hallway damage had been worst, were removed from the layout entirely. Guests who stayed later said they never noticed anything unusual, except that the numbering skipped from 11 straight to 16. It was December 2nd, 2016. The cold had set in early that year across Krakow's Nowa Huta district, and the courtyard between concrete apartment blocks echoed with the crunch of boots on frost. Tomasz Wojcik pulled his white service van into his usual spot, headlights cutting briefly across cracked pavement before everything went dark forever. Tomasz was a 34-year-old licensed electrician who had spent 12 years working residential jobs across Krakow, building a reputation as dependable, soft-spoken, and almost obsessively thorough. Friends described him as private but principled, traits that would ultimately cost him his life. 6 months earlier, those principles had put Tomasz on a collision course with his past. When his old friend Dawid M. drove drunk and killed a pedestrian, Dawid expected the silence that often protects friendships in tight-knit communities. Instead, Tomasz gave the court a full statement, detailing everything he'd witnessed. As Dawid was led away in handcuffs, he shouted across the courtroom that Tomasz would regret this. The threat hung over Tomasz. He avoided the bars and old hangouts, telling his wife Lydia not to worry. They had 2 young sons, and most evenings Tomasz came home directly after work, seeking the safety of routine and family. That Friday evening, Lydia was warming pierogi in the kitchen when she heard the familiar rumble of his van. She glanced at the clock, 6:43 p.m., and called to the boys to wash up. Outside, Tomasz stepped from the driver's side and swung his toolbox down, unaware that death was waiting between 2 parked cars. From his second-floor window, Pavel Nowak, a nearby resident, saw the figure emerge from the shadows, a man in a dark jacket and gloves, holding something metallic. At first, Pavel assumed it was a tool, but moments later he heard a sharp shout that made him realize something was wrong. The attacker ran toward Tomasz with a furious scream, threatening retribution. Tomasz turned and raised his arms in defense, but the first hammer blow shattered his forearm, and the second struck near his temple. He staggered and dropped to one knee. The third blow landed on his skull with a sickening crack, sending him collapsing beside his van's front wheel. Lydia opened the building door just as the hammer was lifted again. Her scream echoed through the courtyard. The attacker hesitated, then bolted toward the alley beside the garages. Pavel and another neighbor rushed out barefoot, chasing the killer through side streets, but he vanished into Nova Huta's maze of concrete blocks. They stopped searching and called for help. Tomasz lay unconscious, bleeding heavily from skull and mouth. Lydia knelt beside him, trying to cradle his head. He never regained consciousness. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes, but Tomasz was pronounced dead an hour later at the hospital. Authorities opened a homicide investigation within 24 hours, naming Dawid M. as a primary suspect based on motive and prior threats. A citywide warrant was issued, and surveillance footage from nearby garages was collected, but no arrest had been made by the year's end. Tomasz's funeral was held 3 days later at the Rakowicki Cemetery, attended by hundreds of co-workers, neighbors, and former clients. His wife Lydia stood beside the coffin with their 2 sons. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.